Welcome to Analyst Talk with Jason Elder. It's like coffee with an analyst, or it could be whiskey with an analyst reading a spreadsheet, linking crime events, identifying a series, and getting the latest scoop on association news and training. So please don't beat that analyst and join us as we define the law enforcement analysis profession one episode at a time.
Thank you for joining me. I hope many aspects of your life are progressing. My name is Jason Elder, and today our guest has 18 years of law enforcement analysis experience. He spent time with the CIA and the New Orleans Police Department. He obtained his master's degree at George Washington University and recently started his own podcast called Jeff-alytics. He's here to talk about, among other things, the do's and don'ts of crime trends. Please welcome Jeff Asher. Jeff, how are we doing?
Doing great. How are you?
I am doing well. How is Louisiana?
It was hot this weekend and now it's cold. And I don't understand it.
Yeah, I guess we're all going through that polar vortex that's going through.
Yeah, I guess so. It's weird. I wish it would decide. I think my allergies wish it would decide.
Don't worry, it's probably going to be like 80s by Thursday. So
Sure.
I'm really excited to talk to you about your podcast, about crime trends, about data. I always like to nerd out on that, but I also want to get your backstory. So let's first just talk about how you discovered the law enforcement analysis profession.
Yeah, so I'm from New Orleans, born and raised, went to the University of Texas, and after that, I was a senior in high school on 9/11 and said, okay, I think I want to do some sort of service. And after I graduated college, I moved up to DC, got my master's degree in security policy studies and at George Washington University, which was like a feeder school to the intel agencies. I was going to grad school at night and started working for DoD as an intern with the Office of Naval Intelligence and interned with the Defense Intelligence Agency and then got a job with CIA and did that for 5 years and loved it, but was ready to move back home. And I didn't have any applicable skill set to anything that was happening in New Orleans. So I talked to the police department and they had not had a crime analyst in decades. And they managed to find funding to bring me on to be the crime analyst. And so I did that. And then I left that and I know I'm jumping ahead, but after I left that was the field that I was working in. And so I've just been doing analysis and data for that for the last 12 years.
So when you were at George Washington, as you mentioned, inspired by the events of 9/11, what was your goal or what did you see your path being as you started at George Washington?
I mean, I wanted to work for the CIA. I've never had a path though. So I don't know, like you tell me in 3 years that I'm an astronaut living on the moon, I'll be like, cool, that sounds fun. There's no path involved.
I gotcha. What was the small police department that you started with?
Started with New Orleans and then was there about a year and a half, started my own consulting gig, was sort of slowly working through that. And you starting up a business, it's hard. And then my wife got pregnant with our first and means like, oh, well, actually health insurance would be nice. So I made a deal with the Jefferson Parish Sheriff's Office, which is kind of the suburbs of New Orleans, that I could work there part-time and keep consulting. And so I did that and did that until I started working got my first sort of big client as a solo consultant and started going solo.
I jumped ahead a little bit. Back up a little bit. So your time with the CIA. So I don't know how much you can talk about, but what can you talk about in terms of your time with the CIA?
There's not so much that I can talk about. It's a little bit difficult. If everybody that's listening to this will sign an NDA and get back to me, though, I could probably talk about it more. I mean, it was a great experience. I was 25 when I started. I was shocked at the amount of experience they were giving to a green 25-year-old. And it was the best learning experience I could imagine. And as far as sort of the intellectual stimulation of learning something new every day and being able to learn things that nobody else in the world knew or the country knew, I got to travel and see the world in my 20s, which annoyed my wife because after that she was like, okay, let's go travel. I was like, I've done that. I don't want to. It was a very unique experience. And the best benefit, I think, is that they taught me to write and to do analysis. And I think one of the challenges that a lot of the younger analysts I see today face is that they've been taught to like code, but they haven't been taught how to write and communicate. And I think that my path was the opposite direction. I learned how to write and communicate, and then I learned how to look at data.
in high school and even through college, did you feel that you were a good writer and then what you learned in the CIA just advanced that? Or did you think that, oh no, I was average and CIA took it to the next level?
I thought it was okay. I mean,
Hmm.
I knew how to write, and I don't know that I was necessarily a good storyteller in
Hmm.
terms of using evidence and information to communicate a narrative. So I think to that effect, I've gotten a lot better, and I think that sort of the training from the CIA largely helps with that. But I don't think I was God's gift to writing or anything like that. Ever.
Hmm.
Still don't, for that matter. But I think
Yeah.
that I'm certainly improved, and I think I can communicate okay.
Do you feel that anybody can learn how to write well?
Yeah, absolutely. I'm never going to write a best-selling novel, but
Hmm.
I don't know that that level of sort of prose is necessary. And honestly, in terms of just writing good analysis, you don't want that level of prose. I remember one of my grad school classes, my favorite class, the professor was this guy, Bob Work. One of the advantages of being at GW was that at the night school at GW was it was taught by professionals. And so he had some senior job at the Pentagon under the Biden administration, I think, but each week he gave us a packet to read of an issue, and our assignment was in one page under 350 words to write an analysis of it. And it was that old quote that I wrote you a long letter because I didn't have time to write a short one. It like the ability to learn in a way that is short and teaches you to write in a page what if you're sort of a traditional thinker might take you 5 or 6 pages is a skill that people need to learn, but everybody can learn it.
I have certain soapboxes as I've been doing this show now for 5+ years. I have certain soapboxes, and then one of them is about writing. Every job announcement for analysts will talk about the desire for speaking and writing, and yet when you go to conferences or you see curriculum, it doesn't seem like there's that much time and energy spent on writing and speaking.
No, entirely. And I mean, we talk speaking. That's the other aspect that I think I got a lot better at thanks to grad school and the CIA. I especially sort of giving presentations and speaking to larger audiences, or honestly just speaking to superiors and people that are in very high pressure policy making roles. I think I learned a lot there. The thing that always I remember is we had these sort of task forces when we were in training. You do 4 months of training, and I did it twice for 2 different jobs. So you're doing this long training session, and the objective is everybody has a role, and some people are analysts. I think I was a briefer to the director of the CIA. Obviously, it's not the actual director. It's the teacher that's running the class. It's the director. But so we're in this thing, and if each person doesn't fulfill their role, then it describes how the script will go. And somebody that went before me had not said something or briefed them about something. And so something bad happened to the group. And so my job was to present our information to the director, not knowing that someone had screwed up in front of me. And so I had a 5-minute briefing, which is a very difficult thing to do. And so I'm prepared for it and I'm ready for it. And the guy walks in and I'm about to start and he just starts screaming at me about the guy that hadn't done their job before me. And I just got screamed at for 5 minutes. And anytime I do a briefing, I'm like, well, it can't be worse than that time.
Oh
So
my
I
gosh.
mean, that's the type of thing that I think helps you a lot when you're in a different audience and trying to speak to, a large audience of professionals or a large audience of students, which may be even more terrifying.
Oh man. Well, I mean, even to obviously have to think on your toes and have to take in new information, process it, and speak about it. And that's probably what you were preparing to do, trying to prepare for every single scenario, not the one where you're getting yelled at by what happened 5 minutes ago from somebody else.
Exactly.
That's good. So, what made you leave the CIA to come back home to New Orleans?
I'm a native. I'm from
Hmm.
here. I got married and was just ready to come back. And you look at the condo in Navy Yard, DC, I was living in for 800 square feet, and the like, oh, I could get a nice house down in New Orleans for
Yeah.
the cost of this. And my parents are down here,
Hmm.
and so it just became something that I eventually just sort of wanted to be back home is essentially it. And So I left in 2013, and I definitely missed the work quite a bit, but my kids get to grow up near my parents, and I get to take my kids to Saints games and things like that. So it can be beautiful.
Yeah, we used to live in Baltimore, and it was before we had kids, just similar to your situation. And my wife and I often say like, oh, it would be nice to take the kids to DC this weekend type of thing, because we would go to DC often when we lived in Baltimore as just a day trip, and just there's a lot obviously there to consume, and with the kids it would make it more special.
Yeah, absolutely. It's nice. And so you sacrifice a little bit of the work for the possibility of the work-life balance.
Yeah. So in terms of your transition professionally, how was it going from federal to local?
It wasn't, I wouldn't call it easy. I think that it's the type of thing that, and not just going federal to local, but from a intel capacity to a crime analysis capacity, and going from an agency that had obviously lots of experience doing analysis and had sort of a program and a set way of doing it, to an agency that hadn't had analysts in decades. And so it was certainly a challenge. You're kind of speaking a different language, and so getting them to learn what the language is definitely a challenge.
So take us through just that first couple weeks, maybe first couple months of walking in there, and what it was like, some of the obstacles that you faced, and what you were able to build.
I mean, honestly, the biggest obstacle was that there was no bureaucracy set up. There was no hierarchy. There was no ability to even get my email set up from like the natural, oh, here's the person that does that, and that's who you talk to. And so it was quite a challenge to come in as a civilian at an agency that did not have civilians that do those types of things. So a lot of it was just figuring out the software, figuring out how to operate, how to get in the door, how to get a keypad that would open the door so I didn't have to get locked out each time. I mean, these are the very real challenges that were not necessarily easy to overcome, and took a few weeks. And then figuring out, okay, these are my customers, this is my account, what do they want? And that is the challenge of every analyst, I think. And it's even more so when there's nobody to tell you who the customers are and what it is that they want.
Yeah. Now, do they know what they wanted?
No, not at all.
I mean, that's usually kind of the challenge. I speak to so many analysts, and they were like, "There's your computer, go." Like that's no real guidance or goals or anything like that. Just go do.
Yeah, I mean it's like it's good and it's bad, right? You can go. There's freedom to do anything, but also it gets boring to constantly be working on projects that nobody cares about and trying to drum up interest in it. And that is the challenge.
Yeah. And I struggled with that. I struggled like that being an individual analyst at a police department. I struggled with that program building. Then when I was part of a team of analysts, I was like, oh, like this is way different. And I actually really enjoyed being part of an analytical team as opposed to trying to do that program building.
Yeah, I mean, I never got that. I never got the team because I was by myself at NOPD, and then when I left, they hired a director of analytics and created an analytics department, and then so now I've been consulting after that. So I definitely missed that, and certainly with the agency, you're working with a team and with you have somebody ahead of you that knows what the way it's done and has subject matter expertise, and so much subject matter expertise that it makes it a lot easier to sort of walk those streets.
During your time in New Orleans PD, then what were some of the problems that you were dealing with? What were some of the crime trends then?
Well, I mean, gun violence is there's not really a trend other than gun violence in New Orleans. I mean, there are, but the most important and the thing that sets New Orleans apart is the incredible amount of historically shootings that the city's had. And so a lot of my work was around measuring changes. The city implemented, before I came, a program called NOLA for Life, which had a whole bunch of, it was basically focused deterrence. And so they were implementing that, and I was starting to measure the impact of the program, and it worked. And it had about a year of focused deterrence that really reduced gun violence in New Orleans, and then the effects sort of started to wear off. And so I was describing why that was happening, and everyone enjoyed it when you're talking about how everything's getting better and it's probably tied to the work that you're doing. And then when things start to, the effect starts to wear off, people don't like it as much. And so I was doing things like that and trying to evaluate sort of the risk of gun violence, and if we could basically identify who may or may not be at risk for being a victim or a shooter. And some of the work of like Andy Papachristos was really impactful in terms of like influencing the kind of analysis I was trying to do that could in theory help to develop either law enforcement interventions or ideally doing things like providing services and non-law enforcement interventions to people that are at risk, and using some of the data that the city was collecting on shooting victimization. So that was kind of where I went, but it wasn't, I mean, not like in a malicious way, but it wasn't something that the agency was yet super engaged in. And so it was, all right, I'll go do my own thing.
Yeah, I did want to ask you about that transition as well. But back to focus deterrence. Describe that a little bit more for us.
So the idea is that your shootings are concentrated very heavily amongst a very small proportion of your population, and you can identify that population. In New Orleans, they almost exclusively targeted people that they had identified as quote unquote gang members. And they developed, there's a couple of ways of doing it. One is sort of the heavy-handed approach. New Orleans did that particularly well, where they developed all of these indictments using racketeering indictments against dozens of people at a time. And they did a whole bunch of these. And they were taking off the streets people that had committed murders, and they were taking off their sort of associates who were not necessarily engaged in gun violence, but were using those sort of relationships and racketeering indictments to basically get at and demolish entire groups of people. I say demolish, not bring them under and put them under trial and everything like that. And so that was one angle. And then the other angle was doing these sort of call-ins where you go and you tell people, hey, we know that you're doing gun violence, you're shooting people and engaged in this, stop, or we'll put the police on you. But if you do want to stop, in theory, here's some services, and we'll help
programs,
you. Yeah, we'll get you a job or help you keep a job or get you rides or help you pay bills, whatever you need, is kind of the idea behind it. And so focused deterrence is saying, hey, you could try and aim for fixing the root causes of crime, which is this enormous task, or you could go very hyper-focused on who's doing the shootings, because we know that it's very concentrated. It's not random throughout a city, and engage just that population. And so that's kind of the idea behind it. In New Orleans, Robin Engel and Caruso and a bunch of people at the University of Cincinnati came in and actually did an assessment and said, yeah, this was very effective. And then they sort of wore off and they kind of ran out of gang members to indict, is kind of my read on the situation. So yeah, it was a good time. I think if I was only going to be there for 18 months, it was a very interesting 18 months to be there.
Yeah. Well, I was going to ask you, and you just answered it, I believe, is you said it was effective in the beginning, but then it kind of tailored off at the end. And just curious why that pattern was. Why do you think it tailored off?
Well, indictments are really hard. I mean, they take a lot of resources, and there's only a finite number of people that you can kind of use racketeering indictments at either from the federal or the state level. And they kind of went through that group. And so there was a finite amount of reach for the sort of hammer, and they didn't give quite enough effort to the carrot, I guess stick and carrot. So I think if you're not able to sort of stay focused on the program, then the effect wears off. And that's kind of what we saw in New Orleans, I think.
Yeah. I mean, and it is interesting because, I mean, that's obviously can be a lot of work. It's a lot of effort, and if you don't get the good return on investment or you run out of resources, then you can only go so far.
Yeah.
All right. Then after that, you go on your own into consulting. So
I mostly blame my dad. He's been talking to me since as long as I can remember that, hey, if you're a consultant, if you're working for somebody and they wake up and they had a bad night's sleep, they can come in and make your day hell, or they can fire you. And if you work for yourself, that can't happen. And so I basically figured I had this skill set that could be useful, and that there would be a market for just the ability to bring thinking to problems that organizations don't necessarily do. And so I started doing that. I didn't really have any clients, but I was a 30 years old, or no, 30, 32, and thought I could bet on myself. And so went out, and it was a little slow going at first, but it eventually picked up.
Yeah. Talk about that first sales pitch.
Well, so I mean, the first sales pitches were a little bit of law enforcement. They were my favorite, though, was I tried to approach the couple of NFL teams about doing sort of, and I'm a huge sports fan, and so doing sort of NFL draft analysis that people fail, and it's somewhat random who succeeds and who fails, and so the ability to take some of that randomness out of it would really be advantageous. And so I actually I had a buddy that was with the Chiefs and is now with the Panthers, but I went up and was at the Senior Bowl in Mobile and met with them and their GM, and this was a couple of years before Patrick Mahomes. But I met with the Saints. I talked to a couple of other teams. It didn't go anywhere, but I thought it was an interesting approach. And then I met with a whole bunch of police departments. I flew up to Gary, Indiana for a day to meet with the chief there, and there'd been an officer involved shooting the night before, and so I fly up and the chief's not even there. I mean, that was, I think, what it is to pitch your own business and yourself as a consultant. And so one of my approaches was that I don't have a name for myself, and so I was starting out all on my own, and nobody could tell me from anyone else, and I'd worked for faceless bureaucracies my whole life. And so I just started writing. I started a blog where I was looking at New Orleans crime trends, and Michael Lewis, the author, is from New Orleans, and we went to the same high school, obviously a couple of years apart, but I emailed his agent, and our moms knew each other, and so when he was in town, we had lunch, and he introduced me to Nate Silver, running 538 at the time, and Nate, I pitched Nate on a couple of ideas that I've been thinking about as far as like just taking data to analyze crime trends. And so I started working with 538 and wrote a bunch there, and then was working with the Upshot, writing a bunch there. And so there's no one step that takes you. But then eventually I started to get a couple of clients and landed a contract with the New Orleans City Council doing public safety consulting with them. And that was sort of the beginning of it picking up.
Yeah. So, but the writings is what seems like lit the fuse per se on your endeavors there as a consultant. Reading your ideas, reading your analysis, and then like, oh, okay, this isn't just some random guy. we can benefit from how he thinks.
Well, entirely. And I get introduced to people. I have people reach out to me. I mean, it's certainly, I've grown more of a name than I initially had, but having the writing, the ability to just show that I can think and do things, and the problems that I may have written something about a problem that your agency is dealing with, and I can just provide that as sort of an advertisement. It was critical. And then COVID hit. Well, I guess I've been doing it for a few years, but then I started writing and tweeting about COVID and just the data there and what it was showing, and I got a much bigger profile from that. So definitely interesting circumstance.
Yeah. And so, and obviously you're on your own, you're dealing with open source information. It's data that anybody can come across, but you're obviously putting a great understanding behind the data in your articles.
I think that there's like a lot of analysts doing great work for agencies, a lot of data scientists and people working at BJS and FBI and doing really strong work in the field. I thought then, and I think now, that there's not many people that are just trying to communicate this, where the audience is not criminologists, it's not police chiefs within your department, it's the public. And understanding what everything means, I think, is such an important thing. And very few people are doing it. I don't think anybody was doing it way back when. I think there's very few people doing it now. People like Jay Radcliffe are doing incredible work on his podcast and sort of figuring out the social media angle of it. I don't think that there's nearly enough people like that right now.
Yeah. I mean, it's knowing your audience is always a big topic when you're talking about writing or speaking. And we often talk about, on the show, I hear a lot about talking to academics, talking to police, talking maybe to even the city council, but the public's a whole other audience in that as well, and they're going to have their own expectations and going to need to have basically their own language.
Yeah, entirely. And the public is there. The policymakers often take their cues from the public, and so if the public believes that whatever the data says is correct, then that makes it a lot easier for the policymakers to follow the data, and police leadership and city councils and things like that. If the public thinks that everything is getting worse, then there's going to be a subset of policymakers that will not learn even if things are getting better. And I mean, frequently the other way around too, when problems are beginning to show themselves, if that's not made clear, then it makes it difficult for the public to evaluate where to go from there.
Yeah, and we're gonna park that idea for a second there, because we're gonna come back to that, because I know that was one of your first episodes on your podcast. I do want to get a better idea of what you do as consultants. So we're gonna move on to your analyst badge story. And for those that may be new to the show, the analyst badge story is the career-defining case or project that an analyst works. So it's about 2022 here. You're consulting, and you are dealing with one of my favorite topics, response times.
Yeah. So we were talking about this, and you said, "What's your analyst badge story?" And I said, "It's classified." So we're gonna go with the other one, which is that I was working as a public safety consultant with the New Orleans City Council. New Orleans is like everywhere else, only more so. When murder got bad everywhere, it got worse in New Orleans. When staffing got bad everywhere, and lots of the big agencies lost officers, New Orleans lost generally more. And so they went from around 1,200 or so officers and recruits in 2019 to around 950 or so in 2022. And already they were hurting. The agency had 1,500 officers in the sort of wake of Katrina in 2006 and then into like 2010 timeframe, and there had been a hiring freeze, which led them from going about 1,400 to about 1,050, and then they worked their way back up right before COVID to around that 1,200 mark, and then lost it again. And so the 20% drop in officers from a level that was already probably insufficient. In 2019, they had about 50-minute response times. In April of 2023 was kind of the crest. They finished with 180-minute on average response times. And so something like 12 to 15% of emergency calls for service took 60 minutes or more. And so just really bad stuff was happening because of it. There was all sorts of incidents where at the sort of least harmful end of the spectrum, you'd come out, you see your car's been broken into, and you call the police. It's 11 o'clock at night, and they get there, and it's 5 a.m. And obviously you're sleeping, your phone's on do not disturb, and the officer gets there and they say, "Oh, we're gonna mark this as gone on arrival." And so you either have the option of calling again and maybe getting lucky, or more likely not calling and it doesn't get reported. And so in 2019, about 1 in 5, a little less, about 18% of all vehicle burglaries, for example, were listed as gone on arrival. And in 2022, it was almost 40%. So like that's bad. It's not enormously consequential. It gets more consequential when you have things like rapes that went from about 5% were gone on arrival in 2019, and then in 2023 at sort of the height it was 33%. And so you had all of these circumstances. And so what I was doing was working with the council, and we identified 95 rape victims that had called the police, and their cases had been downgraded from an emergency to a non-emergency. And in this case, because of the impact that emergencies they were slow, but they were much faster than non-emergencies, the punitiveness of being downgraded from an emergency to a non-emergency was enormous. And the majority of those cases that were downgraded were marked gone on arrival. And so you've got cases where a woman will call the police department saying that she'd been raped the night before. She's finally worked up the courage, or she's at the hospital or something, and the police department says, "Okay, we'll get to it. When we get to it, you're not in any physical danger right now." And so they get to it, but it's hours later. And so the majority of those were being marked gone on arrival. And then we had several cases where people called the police for domestic violence situations, downgraded from an emergency to a non-emergency, and then hours later, one woman called 11 hours later, the police showed up at 4 a.m. Nobody's there. They mark it gone on arrival. And 5 weeks later, she's murdered by her boyfriend. So it just, there was no appreciation for just how bad things had gotten. And the data was very clear. The department did not like the story that was being told, but it was honest and it was true. And it was, their response was you should use median response time instead of average, which, like, I guess, but that's using median in this case would miss the fact that this enormous growth of outliers on the far end that were not getting the services that they required. And so eventually the police department accepted the findings and began to take steps to fix it. And now I think their response time, it hit 50 minutes on average, 65 minutes on average now, which isn't great, but it was 180 minutes on average 2.5 years ago. So it's significantly better.
Yeah. So what were some of the things that they implemented?
So they hired about 100 contractors, 100 civilians to take over professional staff roles, and they've invested in some of that. The thing that I think was even more impactful is that they hired a third-party contractor that's made up of mostly retired NOPD officers to go out and respond to non-injury traffic accidents. And you're talking thousands upon thousands of these, and they all take 45 minutes to an hour. And so by taking half of those off their plate with a contractor, you're basically, one, you're saving money, and you're in a position to free up thousands upon thousands of hours of officer time to respond to other types of offenses. And so they've been enormously successful. They have fewer officers now than they had in 2023, but they're able to respond more effectively because they become much more efficient. And so it's really, I had a piece in the argument recently about this, that they should be a poster child for how agencies that are struggling with staffing should respond to these problems.
I've always said that for a long time when I see a traffic accident, like, why is it an officer that's responding to the call kind of thing? That definitely should be something that it does. That's kind of a lower level event anyway. With the civilians that they did hire, does that mean that they were replacing officers that were doing those positions and then they put those officers out on the streets, so to speak, or were they just doing a total different function? Do you know?
I don't know specifically how they were being deployed, but that was kind of the idea.
Yeah. And then do you know what the response rate is now for a rape call?
So now they're back to, I don't have the exact numbers, but I think that they're back to like 10% as opposed to a third were being marked gone on arrival. The other thing that they've done is they've set aside for those types of victims a specific unit whose job is to call back and make sure that those are not falling through the cracks, which is another great way. Even if you can't have fast response times, then you can potentially not victimize a person twice.
Have they published anything about getting other city departments involved?
Not that I know of specifically. It's always a challenge. I was doing some sort of TV interview with a member of the police union, and one of the big issues here is Mardi Gras, and they basically deploy the entire department for several straight days. And that's a real challenge to their staffing. And the union member was like, well, you can't use anybody but police officers for Mardi Gras. It's like, well, why not? Why couldn't you use just traffic people to help direct traffic? Doesn't necessarily have to be somebody with a badge and a gun. So I think that there are definitely ways to be more efficient that the department and the city could explore, but they've done a great job of doing that already.
Yeah, and I think it's unfortunate it got that bad before. That's some of those numbers are pretty stark. So, but I guess it is good that they are improving and they're doing what you always hear when there's budget issues: do more with less.
Yeah, and there's ways to do that, and I think that there's clear ways to do it that can be effective and smart. And so I think agencies that are having similar problems should definitely explore it, would be my advice.
Hello, this is Joshua Todd, U.S. Border Patrol, Buffalo Sector Intelligence at Wellesley Island Station. And I'd like you to remember that numbers on the page are reflective of the humans that we serve. We've had a recent report of an overdose in the county, and we discussed it at a local meeting. And then later that day, I went to the barber and got a haircut, and the woman was visibly distraught, and we got to chatting, and it was actually her son that overdosed and passed away that last week. So while we do a lot of reports and they are numbers on the spreadsheet, they end up reflecting the humans that we do serve.
You didn't do the dishes?
Well, no, I was busy doing other chores. But my completed chores is up 5 in the last 7 days.
Yeah, but you're still down 13 over the last 28 days.
Well, I see your shopping purchases is up 20% this month.
My spending is still down year to date. In fact, my black shoe purchases are half of what they were this time last year.
Well, thank goodness last year wasn't a normal year.
Plus, I bought you new underwear, so your clothes purchases is up 40% this month compared to last month.
Oh, wait, there were no clothes purchases the previous month, Miss Perfect. I didn't know you had the ability to divide by 0.
You should be happy. Your temperature-led policing program has worked great in this house. I have not touched your precious thermostat in the last 6 months.
Millions of homes in the U.S. are impacted by people wanting to be comfortable in their homes. Temperature-led policing. Control the temperature, control the cost.
Let's talk about crime trends, and then I want to get into your podcast a little bit more. The perception of crime trends, we talked about a little bit about what the public thinks, what the public perceives, how the public is communicated with. I guess just one of the things I was thinking about as I was preparing for this interview is, do people really know what crime trends are?
Probably not. I mean, some people definitely do. Many people probably don't, I think has been sort of my read on it. They had a poll from YouGov a few months ago that asked people, were there more murders this year, or there more murders last year or this year than in 2020 and in 1990? And regardless of age or race or gender or political persuasion, everyone said there's more murders now than there were 35 years ago. And it's just like the type of thing that makes one's head explode, that people generally don't inherently perceive it. And I think the last few years, I mean, obviously partisanship has always played a role and politicization has always played a role. But the last few years, I think it's taken on an outsized role, which has been extremely unfortunate to sort of witness.
Yeah, and I think a lot of it, I would think back, you mentioned the University of Cincinnati. I went to graduate school in the University of Cincinnati, and I remember Dr. Francis Collin used to talk about the social consciousness and like what just the society defines as a whole and what they find it to be important. And it does seem like there's just certain topics that really get the focus. You just off the top of my head, like you always see about shark attacks every summer. It seems like that's a big deal. And then when they look at the data, it's like, they're not any more or less numbers wise than they were the last 5 years. But if it gets into the news and it gets into the news cycle and it takes a life of its own.
Yeah, it's the saying that the media doesn't cover the planes that land, I think is a big issue. And obviously you want to cover the plane crashes, you want to cover the tragedies, but you also want to use the available data to effectively evaluate what the actual trends are. And very recently in New Orleans, I got annoyed by this situation where New Orleans has had this immense decline in gun violence. I mean, they had an enormous amount of shootings in sort of 2020 to 2022 timeframe, where they went from like 300 to 400 shootings incidents a year to almost 700 in 2023. Might have actually exceeded 700. And then they had this enormous decline. And last year there were something like under 300 shootings, and they're on track to have the fewest murders since 1970 this year. So enormous drop in gun violence. And there was a spike in murders where they had something like 10 murders in 14 days or some horrific trend that was short-lived and got coverage. The fact that in the middle of October they had this short or small surge, but I was struck by the fact that they went 10 days with one shooting for the first time in the 15 years of data that I have in the middle of September, and that didn't generate a peep. And then they went, they had like 14 shootings in 10 days in the first half of October, and that got all of this news coverage and just an enormous amount of news coverage. And then the shooting, it was just it was bad and terrible, but largely random, not the start of some new trend. And then it went back to no coverage. And I think that influences people's perceptions so much that it's really hard to say this is a new trend. This horrific increase in gun violence is something we need to really be paying attention to because it signals something new, versus like, this is not a new trend. This is obviously an issue that isn't solved and is something that we should be trying to deal with, but is not necessarily like, this isn't the start of something that requires a whole new approach inherently. And I don't know that like, how do you take something that this is very serious, this remains a serious problem, it's just not a worsening problem, it might even be a problem that's getting better. How do you convey that to the public? And I think it's very difficult.
Yeah, in that situation, obviously, it's almost feels like it's separate. I understand it's all crime trends, but as you mentioned, it was a period of time, a short-lived period of time, fortunately, but it's going to have that lasting effect. And I guess I'm curious from like, why do you think it's like so hard to communicate good news? Right, like obviously the old saying is, if it bleeds, it leads, right? That's obviously the public is what the public interest is. But I mean, I don't know. It just seems like it should be easier to promote good news.
I think it's hard because I'm a lifelong Saints fan, and I don't know when this is going to run, but like the Saints just beat the Panthers yesterday, giving away when we're recording this, but
That's okay.
They played well. The Tyler Shuck, their new rookie quarterback, had 280 something yards passing, and he had two touchdowns, and they forced all these turnovers. It was great. I have all of this data that shows yesterday was great for the Saints.
Mm-hmm.
You don't have data on crime not happening, and that's what the positive is. And so I think it makes it very difficult to necessarily evaluate a positive if you can't necessarily put numbers behind it. The absence of stories about murders is the thing that leads to that contributes to a reduction or contributes to what you want to see. But I don't know how you build like a scorecard of these are times when we didn't have crime.
Yeah. But I mean, I still think in terms of what the numbers show, I mean, to go from 700 to less than 300, maybe breaking a half a century long record is certainly something that should be celebrated and easy to convey.
Yeah, and it's something that, I mean, you see it in surveys of residents that they're more satisfied now than they were. But in 2022, when the city had the nation's highest murder rate, the satisfaction level was 33%. I just pulled up the survey. In 2019, when they had the fewest murders previously in the last 50 something years, it was only 54%. So there's sort of a level at which last year, the Gallup survey that just came out, that 49% of people said that they thought crime had risen in the last year. And like, that's the first time since 2001, I think, under 50%. But it's still 49% of people that are wrong about the trend. And it's not, I can appreciate that it's still a serious issue and that it's something that needs to be taken with solutions. But also at the same time, like, it'd be nice if we could recognize that it's going down.
Yeah. Because I think it is. There is always those surveys that tell you quite a different picture from what the stats tell you, right? Those can be moving in opposite directions, and it is difficult to wrap your head around and to inform, right? We are both blessed and cursed as a society these days that we have so much data, so many data resources, but it also makes it so hard to get everybody on the same page.
Yeah, it does. And nobody's getting their news from the same sources, and it makes it very difficult to portray because people rely on intuition and gut and anecdote, and I don't know how you overcome that. It's definitely, I think the only way to overcome it is to constantly always be talking about what it is.
Yeah. No, in your experience, was there like a crime trend that you saw where like you just maybe you thought it was a bigger deal, but the public just wouldn't, or maybe even the client wouldn't just take it seriously, or is this something that they only want to see, maybe they only want to talk about murders, and there's all these other crime trends out there where they're actionable, but people don't want to talk about those particular crime trends.
Not really. I think usually the things I write about murder do better than anything else. But I think that the other challenge is that I did a thing talking about how theft is falling. The reported theft is falling considerably, but reported shoplifting is rising, and it's hard to say exactly why that is. It's probably a reporting thing, but it's the type of thing that I find really interesting. But our shoplifting data is terrible, and so it's hard to say whether or not it's actually a thing. And that's not of like huge interest to anybody, but I think I find it interesting.
Yeah, the whole shoplifting thing is interesting. Joe Ryan, he works for Multitude now. He talked about shoplifting, and it ended up being for Victoria's Secret in Washington, D.C. But when he was on the show, he talked about like how simple it was to deter shoplifting, and the program that was highly successful in deterring shoplifting there. It seems like that's like low-hanging fruit where really big impacts can easily be made.
Yeah, I would think so. And I've talked to the retail foundations and groups that are talking about this, but their data is so bad. It makes it very difficult to know what's real and what's not.
Yeah, and the different store policies on how they deal with shoplifters, right? I've talked to some folks that if you accuse somebody of shoplifting and you're wrong, you lose your job.
Yeah, and it's very difficult. They don't know what is shrinkage, what is employee theft, and what is theft from the populace or from your shoppers. And so that alone makes it extraordinarily difficult to know what is happening and what you should be caring about, and whether or not frequently you'll get breathless press releases about how bad crime is. And so we're moving this store that also happened to not be doing very well because there was a competing store down the street, but we're not going to talk about that. And it's very easy to blame crime, and then all of a sudden everyone thinks, oh, crime's out of control, when it's not even something that we're measuring accurately.
Yeah, and it's funny how just businesses just eat it. They just put it into their equation on what they need to charge and costs,
100%.
and right, like it always amazes me. It's been a while since I've seen the data, but the self-checkout line, like they easily lose like 5% with self-checkout lines, but they rather just eat the 5% than pay
cheaper
people,
than hiring
pay people to be there.
Yeah.
And that's just kind of amazing me. And some of that is accidental, some of that is actual theft, but it's still money going out the door that they're not really trying to track seriously, as you mentioned.
Yeah, I mean, absolutely. And it makes it difficult as a trend to be able to evaluate.
All right. Let's get into the podcast then.
Right.
Just talk about how this idea happened, and where is it and where is it going?
So started Jeff-alytics podcast, wherever you get your podcasts. And the idea was basically that people perceive crime trends wrong and not as problematic when the issue is going up, but especially when it's going down, people tend to only think it's going up. And so the idea behind the podcast is that it's not enough just to put the data out there, but that we need to talk about it. And so I'm talking to people that either have what I think are interesting thoughts about the sort of human condition and why that this gap between perception and reality exists, and what we need to do to fix it. And so usually people that either have ideas about that or people that are doing things to fix it. And so my first guest was Michael Lewis, which I thought did a great job of sort of setting the stage for what the communication challenge is. And I've had Laura Arnold with Arnold Ventures, who's funding the real-time crime index that I work on soon. I'll have Larry Krasner coming up soon, Paul Krugman, and a whole bunch of other fun guests, Ganesha Martin, who's in Minneapolis doing their consent decree. And it's just, I see why you do it. It's fun. It's interesting. I get to have a weekly conversation and Larry Krasner, whose show is coming up next, I thought had the best advice, which I was like, what do you do to convince people about this? And so you just talk about it. You got to keep talking about it. And there is a dearth of people talking about consistently what does the data show and how can we communicate this better. And so for me, it's fun because I get to talk to interesting people and learn about it. And so that always interests me.
Yeah, well, I can see it being almost like how you started your consulting, right? You started out writing, and that led to opportunities. And so I can see this podcast, you start talking, and it's going to lead to opportunities.
Yeah, that's kind of the idea. And it's different because I'm not a good question asker, or I'm not a natural question asker, I'll say. So figuring out how to talk to people and have sort of engaging questions that aren't being asked of me is an interesting new challenge, which is fun to be learning still how to communicate at a later stage of my career, towards the later stage of my career. I think is really interesting and fun.
Yeah, I think it might have been on episode 1 with Michael Lewis. I think there was a saying, if you've thought about it, you've thought about it too much. And I think for me, there's times in terms of asking the right question. As I'm going through editing, I was like, oh, why didn't I ask that question? Or why I should have asked this question next. And so if I don't think about it, it's fine. I can just edit and it just flows, and it is what it is. But there's times when I'm like, oh, it would have been so great if I would have asked this question, or I would have went down this path of the conversation, and then it kind of bothers me for a little bit, and then I move on. But so it's one of those deals that, don't hang up too much on trying to be perfect and ask the best question each and every time. I think one of the things, as we were prepping, I told you I don't script the show. We come up with some topics, and I ask some follow-up questions, and we move on to the next one. So, but it seemed like you're naturally inquisitive, though, right? You might not think you asked the right question, the best question, but I think you're naturally inquisitive, which will help you in your endeavor.
Well, I think the advantage is that I don't know the answer of how do we effectively communicate this. I'm genuinely curious, and I like hearing from other people. And it's been nice because I feel like each guest has had a different opinion of what can be done. And it's I think neat to be able to hopefully learn from that.
Well, I like the topic with Michael Lewis when you were talking about the car thefts. I think it was in Minneapolis, but it's everywhere. I guess it's everywhere, with the USB, able to use a USB to steal the vehicle.
Right.
And something like that, as it plays out, the data will tell you the outlier, right? So you can then focus on it, and you both did a good job of kind of honing in on the progression of that story. But then when you get to some of these more macro events, it's interesting to me that we can't seem like we ever find a true answer to the question. Like, I think you might have very much touched on, like, why did the crime drop in the 90s? There's whole textbooks written on various theories on why crime dropped in the 90s. And then I think you were talking a little bit recently why crime is dropping in certain cities. So it amazes me that there becomes so many different factors that it's hard to pinpoint one. It seems like there's always going to be a debate, and we'll never truly find out the answer.
Yeah, it is. And it's like you said, we do have ideas. We have lots of good ideas about why crime dropped in the 90s. We don't know for sure. And and I get asked all the time, why did murder rise in 2020 and why is it falling now? And I feel like the more confidence that I hear somebody explain it with, the less likely I am to believe them. And I think the healthy skepticism is necessary in this field, which is probably not the great. It's good, but also not the greatest thing in the world to have that worldview.
Yeah, and I guess there's just becomes so many variables. I don't know. That's the only thing I could think of, because it's just when it's at that level with the USBs, right? You can look at the data.
And that one's rare. That one's easy. They're rarely that easy.
Yeah, but when you're talking about such a high level, and it's probably what it is. It's multiple factors. It's not just one smoking gun. It's multiple factors. Multiple people doing things differently.
Yeah, and it's usually complicated, and it's what we're seeing in terms of like the federal deployments now is that people want immediate answers, and we're seeing like in Washington D.C. they deployed the National Guard, and more importantly, probably they deployed several hundred federal law enforcement officers onto the streets. And there was a short-term drop in shootings, and people, oh, look, it worked. But then within 6 weeks, it wore off. And so I think that people want sort of, one, they want the easy answers, and two, they want to immediately jump to a conclusion. And I think that usually, as I've been asked repeatedly over the last few months about DC, we don't know is the answer as far as what's the cause, what's this going to do, and how long is it going to last. And people are not good at being patient.
Yeah, that's for sure. And even if you give them like 5 good answers, they're only going to latch on to one, maybe 2.
Oh yeah, the first one you say.
Like, oh, if that resonates with them, oh, that makes sense. Okay, that's what I'm going with from now on.
Yeah, absolutely.
Oh man. So you mentioned creating the real-time crime index. I find that fascinating. So let's go over what that is and then get into it a little bit.
All right, let's do it.
All right. So what is the real-time crime index?
The real-time crime index is a sample of data from, right now we're at around 550 agencies nationwide. The cutoff for inclusion is cities of 50,000 or more, or counties of 100,000 or more. And the goal is to mimic national crime trends as they develop. So basically mimic what the FBI is going to report when it reports its data in August, September of next year, but do it right now and do it with a sufficiently large sample. So we have around, 4%, 3 to 4% of the nation's agencies, covering around a third, maybe a little bit more of the nation's population, and about 54% of the nation's murders. So it's a really good sample for evaluating the trends and seeing them as they occur. The idea is basically that we don't have this ability. Absent sampling lots and lots of cities, there's no other way to know what our nation's crime trends are other than just sort of waiting.
Yeah, so this is the closest data set that you know of that really can take the temperature, so to speak, of crime on any given day.
Yeah, and that's the idea, is to, it's not exactly real time. It has a 45-day lag, but we're able to tell right now what is happening nationally in a way that, if you remember back to 2020, it wasn't until kind of mid-fall that people were kind of grappling with the fact that murder was rising. And now we could do that with like a month later.
Yeah. So what is murder doing?
Right now it's falling dramatically. Mm-hmm. We have it down around 20% this year relative to last year, a little less, maybe closer to 19%. Having fallen, the FBI had it at almost 15% last year. We had it closer to 13%. And the year before that, it was 10-ish%. So we're on track for the third straight massive drop in murder. All crime types that we measure are down quite a bit. Violent crime is down around 10%. Property crime is down around 13% this year compared to last year. So it's a remarkable change in crime that we're seeing right now, a historic drop across pretty much every category.
Now, is that drop due to the fact that it rose several years ago, or is this dropping in even terms of comparing it over the decades?
Oh, the likelihood is that we'll see the lowest or amongst the lowest murder rates ever recorded this year. So we were roughly around 2019 levels last year. And so kind of erasing the totality of the post-2020 spike. This year, we're going to hit numbers that we haven't seen before, and with data back to 1960 from the FBI, or be right around those numbers. It's kind of hard to say exactly what the murder rate will be this year.
Yeah, and then we're going to, like we said before, now we're going to have this race to see who can explain why.
Yeah, and I like to leave that to others.
Okay. Was there anything in the data as you were collecting this that surprised you?
That's a good question. There's tons in there that's surprising. I think the ability to see things that you kind of intuit, but see them on a graph, I think is certainly fascinating. You see like the vehicle burglaries, or the vehicle thefts of Kias and Hyundais after that video hit TikTok is fascinating, I think, to see in the data. It's honestly, just the entire shape of the decline, I think, is terrific. It's fascinating. It doesn't surprise you. My team thinks I'm a giant nerd, but I liken it to when the astronomers took a picture of the black hole, and like you had artist renderings that kind of said this is what it should look like, but now you're actually seeing it, and we can actually see the nation's murder trend and see when it eventually starts to level out. We'll be able to see that, and that I think is going to be fantastic.
Yeah, I wonder.
Leveling out of murder will not be fantastic. The ability to see it will be.
Yeah. Good clarification.
Thank you.
So, have you heard anything from the FBI? Like, are they like, oh man, like there's somebody doing this. We better make sure we got our P's and Q's in order.
No, I mean, like most federal agencies, there's undergone a lot of changes in the last year or so. When we were building it, we had somewhat frequent communications with the FBI. They seemed to be on board with it and liked it. And honestly, it's another way of looking at the data they're putting out and confirming what they're putting out. And so I think that they appreciate that it's got that value to it. The FBI is collecting data from 18,000 agencies, and that's a wholly different task. And so we're just trying to communicate, what does this data tell us, and what can we learn from it, and what do we need to respond to right away? And I think that that's not something that the FBI is trying to do. And so it's stepping into the void and filling a role.
All right. So what's next for the Real-Time Crime Index?
So next, we are going to be launching a site in the spring that will take all of this data. It'll be redo it all, fancy it up, and then add on top of that the historical data. The FBI has historical data going back to 1930, and a lot of it is in just sort of scanned in PDFs. So we're digitizing that, and we're going to produce that, and you can see Chicago murders back to 1930. You can see Philadelphia staffing back to 1930. You can see clearance rates probably back to the 1960s, and see these things as they've developed and be able to pull up historical figures as far back as we have them, which I think will hopefully be a great resource for people.
Excellent.
And very creatively, we're changing the name of the new site. It was the Real-Time Crime Index. We're going to call it, we had hours and hours of consultant hours burned in this. We're going to call it the Crime Index.
Sometimes the simplest is the best, right?
Yeah. A 7-figure contract to McKinley to come up with that answer.
Yeah, what it reminds me is like those cities will do that, where they need that tagline or for their city or their new marketing campaign, and they'll spend 6+ figures on that to come up with, and they come up with something that's like 5 words.
Yes, entirely.
All right, very good, Jeff. All right, well, let's move on to advice for our listeners, our analysts, because I do want to spend a little bit of time as we're finishing up this interview on just your advice for analysts as they're dealing with crime trends, as they're dealing with storytelling, as maybe even if it's just time, we can even talk a little bit about dealing with automation. But just kind of wanted to get your advice on whether you're talking about new analysts, experienced analysts. What is your message to them in terms of what your view on crime trends?
I mean, my usual message is learn how to be a good writer. I think that's the most important thing that analysts can do, and learn how to communicate as a writer and a presenter effectively. Everything else from there is sort of flows from there. I think that analysts going out and finding new data sets, and I haven't worked for a police department in a decade, but I think that, I guess less than that, but either way, it's been many years since I last worked for a police department, and I think that for the most part, agencies are too focused on using their analysts in terms of like basically being mini detectives, looking for micro crime trends, understanding who's in a neighborhood committing vehicle burglaries. And I think analysts can be very effective looking at the big picture strategic stuff, and in looking at the internal management type analyses and evaluating how the department is functioning. I think that you can get a lot more from an analyst doing that than putting together bulletins about vehicle burglaries, is sort of my opinion.
I think it's an interesting take, because I also know that if analysts are given the choice, most analysts are going to choose to write the bulletin, to be the gumshoe, or go after the tactical analyst as opposed to the administrative or strategic analyst.
Yeah, probably. I don't have a ton of insight into what today's analysts think, but I think that
That's just anecdotal.
There's so much more that analysts can do than just respond to individual or small tasks. And I think that because most agencies are only going to have a handful of analysts, that they're best used in the big picture stuff. And that's where you get the most bang for the buck, would be my guess. And that's where I found the most impact in my work as a consultant, is in looking at the big picture, finding the big problems, and bringing it to leadership or policymaker attention.
Yeah. I feel for today's analysts in terms of just the amount of data, because I feel that there's so much data, so many options. It kind of makes it difficult to really be an expert in any like one thing, in terms of just really focusing on an analytical task. Because I just feel that there's, if you're whether you're doing tactical or whatever you're being asked to do by a supervisor, if they're just whatever the issue of the day is that they're trying to tackle, is the analyst is spending enormous amount of time just trying to go through the data, aggregate it, just clerical stuff.
Yeah, I mean, absolutely. My experience has been that the sort of the tactical stuff, I mean, you have to find policymakers and leadership that'll listen to you. And I think that that is the real challenge. And the more you get up the chain, sort of as an aside, I think that the challenge I faced in New Orleans, like, I guess getting back to kind of this concept of the advice I'd give analysts, is to figure out your hierarchy, or construct your hierarchy in such a way that you're able to be as close as possible to your leadership, because that's so critical. And if leadership is not listening to you in any way, then you're not doing as much as you can possibly do as an analyst, I would argue.
Yeah. I just had Phil Powell on. He's from Jamaica, and in his program, they actually have a program for leaders and executives on basically how to use an analyst and how to treat them, like what they should and shouldn't be doing, which is a big part of their leadership training. It's great to get everybody on the same page on what they should and shouldn't be doing.
Yeah, that's a great idea, because I think I said a while back, it's a new language, especially if you're in a department that doesn't know how to use an analyst. It's very difficult. You have to make sure that the analyst can talk to you and that you can understand what they're saying. It's definitely a challenge.
So would your advice be if an analyst maybe is dealing with the public, is answering questions about data, or just what are some quick tips you would have for the analyst in communicating with the public?
I think be specific, obviously, and be evidence informed. Like, be able to back up what you're saying, and don't be hyperbolic, I think, is the key. I mean, I've been called pithy, which I take as a compliment. I think that the analyst's ability to say what the trend is or what they're analyzing, and do it in a way that makes them come across as, oh, this is a professional that does not have a dog in the fight, but is evaluating this dispassionately and is telling me what's happening. It's critical for that, using that ability to communicate with policymakers and leadership. And it's just as critical, I think, to use that kind of language to communicate with the public. And when I write, that's how I try to write every time. I know everybody's biased. We all have biases. I like to think that my writing does not convey my biases. I'm guessing that my choice of subject matters is what conveys my biases. But when I take up a subject to analyze it, I try to be as neutral and straightforward as possible. And so I guess that would be my advice, is to do that.
Mm-hmm. And finishing up with personal interest, then you're a father of 4, all under 10. So did they go trick or treating?
They did. Yeah.
All right. What were the costumes?
We had a dragon. We had a police officer. My daughter was a leopard. And I do not remember. Hang on one second. I'm pulling up my Halloween pictures. So he went as a baseball player to school. He got a costume as a something, I don't remember what, and decided he didn't like it. I think it was a fireman costume, and he decided he didn't like it. So that night, we don't have any pictures of him, so I don't know what he went as.
No, he went to multiple things, it sounds like.
Yeah.
in terms of like data, here's what I always tell kids. I was like, I always know what the worst Halloween candy is. It's whatever's left over after 2 or 3 weeks.
Oh no, we threw away last year's candy because we don't go through it fast enough. I mean, you got 4 of them. My 9-year-old went by himself for the first time with some friends, and he was walking along and then came home and dumped out his bucket and then went back out and filled it up again. So we cleaned up. I was saying we should melt down the chocolate, put it in like bar form, and fill it and sell it on the neighborhood like world's greatest chocolate style.
Yeah, see, yep. The chocolate always goes first. It's always like Smarties or bottle caps or lollipops, or those are the stuff that's left. It seems like at the end of 2 or 3 weeks. But yeah, the chocolate always goes.
Yeah, well, we'll have it for a year. That's the way it is.
Yeah, and I don't know, for some reason, my wife's family, in terms of Christmas, like their stockings are all filled with candy. So it's almost like I get double whammy between Halloween and Christmas.
Yeah, that's a lot of candy. That's a little too much candy for me.
Yeah. All right, very good, Jeff. Thank you again for being on the show here today. Best of luck with the podcast and your endeavors. We're going to finish up with words to the world now. This is where you can promote any idea that you wish. What are your words to the world?
I think that from a career standpoint, my words to the world would be do what you find interesting. And I think that when I've found ways of doing that, it's been so much more rewarding from a career perspective and intellectually stimulating and doing things that I really enjoy. And I think that it makes it a lot easier and it makes it easier to have impact. So I guess that would be my word to the world.
Very good. Well, I leave every guest with you've given me just enough to talk bad about you later.
All right, good.
But I do appreciate you being on the show, Jeff. Thank you so much, and you be safe.
Thanks for having me. I appreciate it. Take care.
Thank you for making it to the end of another episode of Analyst Talk with Jason Elder. You can show your support by sharing this and other episodes found on our website at www.leapodcasts.com. If you have a topic you would like us to cover or have a suggestion for our next guest, please send us an email at leapodcasts@gmail.com. Till next time, analysts, keep talking.